Why always come back to the motivation? Why is the motivation so important, even in the very beginning? Um, by motivation, I understand it as bodhicitta. The answer here, and part of it goes all the way back to the Four Noble Truths, where the Buddha teaches that life in its ordinary state, life in general, is suffering, is discontent. Yeah, and it's about specifically about suffering. So when we talk about motivation and bodhicitta or the bodhisattva ideal, we're talking about attending to suffering because it is so utterly ubiquitous. And there is also an end to suffering, as the Four Noble Truths tell us. And we have this, of course, in Theravada, Zen, other traditions that perhaps don't emphasize bodhicitta as much. It doesn't mean it's not there. It's just, it doesn't use that terminology. Compassion and loving kindness, extremely important in the Theravada as well. Now, in part of the motivation aspect here is, first of all, that we practice because we recognize that we need something. Many of us come to practice because we're suffering and we're looking for a way out. And that was certainly my case when I was in my early 20s and I was dealing with anxiety, with terrible anxiety and some depression and all of that. And meditation just became the only thing that was helpful for me. And I would go and listen in the Village Zendo to teachers and the Open Center in New York, and where I was living, and I lived in Manhattan for 10 years, and really found kind of a refuge there. Now, at first it was very self-involved, yeah? And I think a lot of us maybe come to practice initially because of that, because we're focused on our own suffering. And what's interesting is, and I think what the great masters of Mahayana Buddhism recognize is that the more you begin to practice, the more that you are able to sort of hold your own suffering and then work with the reasons behind it and overcome them on some level. It doesn't mean that we are suffering free for the rest of our lives, but we learn how to relate differently to our suffering. Is that it opens our view. And it's seen to be that recognizing motivation is a couple of things. One, it opens our view, and the recognition of suffering, the ubiquity of suffering, means, oh, it's not just my suffering I'm experiencing, but this is a human condition that I'm in. It kind of helps to see yourself not as the only one who is sitting here in all of these discontentedness, but you're seeing almost a cosmology of suffering. Yeah. And you're not content just to say, I don't care. I don't care about other people's suffering. But that person's suffering is my suffering is that person's suffering. There is a force behind that shift that is both extremely beneficial for our practice. It wakes us up because it matters. And it's extremely important to others how we show up. The other part of this is that why motivation is important at the beginning is practice can very quickly turn into an egoic process. Yeah? Look at what I can do. Look at what I've been able to do. You should do it too. You're not doing it. Oh, it's your fault that you're suffering. All of this kind of posturing that happens. That is the artificiality that many of the masters say this is dangerous. And so we always want to come back to the fundamental motivation for our practice, not just feeding more egoically, the pitfalls and the unwholesome karma that is so slippery that we can delude ourselves into thinking that we're doing something good, but really we're doing something to build ourselves up and feel better about ourselves. And if it just ends there, we're off the path, yeah? Or we're still on the path, but we've taken kind of a side path and thinking that we're on the main path, but we're on a side path going God knows where. And so the masters, they recognize that motivation is that which keeps you really authentic. It keeps you rooted and it keeps you engaged in the larger world. It's not just about you, yourself, and only your practice, but there is this, and it's a cheerleading kind of thing. It's not meant as a moral thing. It's like, hey, guess what? You've discovered mindfulness. You've discovered something that can help you and maybe others, because we're all in this together. Yeah, the mind karma is like this mind. What is this? There is a Tibetan phrase. I don't remember it terribly well, but it's like just daily life can feel like these violent waves crashing back and forth on the rocks of samsara. Yeah, and this is normal. And so if we just live our own little lives and think, well, I'm doing okay, and I don't care about that guy or that person, then we're almost deluding ourselves, because the truth of interbeing, as Thich Nhat Hanh says, or interdependence, means that we're not just transforming ourselves in the process, but we're also bringing something more wholesome into the world. And to understand that, that too can become egoic. Yeah, and so the masters say, great, you're practicing now for all beings, but that can be a trap too. Look at what I'm doing. So come back to basic motivation, that what you're doing is attending to suffering. Yours, theirs, all. It's one and the same. And that's where collectively we can practice and change. And as Ken said, non-meditation becomes a sort of a realization of who we are, and we don't have to react against others anymore. We can maybe show up in a different way, with more patience, easily practiced, and we make a difference.